Income tax 2020. Certain business expenses of reservists, performing artists, and free-based government officials, Form 2106. Come in, relax with Income tax 2020. Certain business expenses of reservists, performing artists, and fee-based government officials, Form 2106. When thinking about the income tax equation, we're going to be on the second line of the income tax equation, remembering that we can break our income tax equation into two halves, the top half being a modified income statement, the second half being then the calculation of the tax and application of the payments and credits related to it to get down to the tax refund or the amount due. We're focusing up top on the modified income statement. We're looking at the second line. You can call the second line the above the line deductions as compared or contrasted to the below the line deductions, which would be either the greater of standard deduction or itemized deductions. Again, there's many names for these adjustments up top. You can call them adjustments to income because they're basically going to be modifying to get to that subtitle kind of along the way, being adjusted gross income, along the way to what would be kind of like net income or taxable income down below. You can call them Schedule 1 deductions. You can call them deductions for AGI type of deductions. Above the line is probably a fairly safe referral to them to compare and contrast them to the other types of deductions, which would be the greater of standard or itemized deductions. Now we're going to be focusing in on, if we look at the 1040 down here once again on line 10, and I know this is kind of small here. We'll look at a practice problem related to this in a future presentation so we can see it in more detail and zoom in on the line items in the form. But this form will of course be supported by the Schedule 1 Part 2. So here we have Schedule 1 Part 2. We're looking at line 11, certain business expenses of reservists, performing artists, and fee-based government officials. We see then the attachment of the Form 2106. This is the Form then 2106, which would be feeding into the Schedule 1 Part 2, which would then feed in, of course, to the 1040. Now, this Form 2106, as we can see here, is labeled Employee Business Expenses. And before, about like 2 years ago, it had a much broader scope, so it would be used in more circumstances. Now this deduction is not as important because it's been severely limited now at this point in time, because this was an attempt, part of the attempt to basically simplify the tax code. So now, if you think about this adjustment to income, it was probably a lot more significant, a few years ago. It certainly was. And now you can think about it in certain circumstances, but it's probably not something that should be jumping in your mind all the time unless you're talking to someone that falls into these particular categories. And that would be reservists, performing artists, and fee-based government officials. If they're talking about other types of business expenses in this Form 2106 that maybe they got deductions for in the past, then it's not going to be applicable because it's been restricted a lot down at this point in time. Now, again, this could change next year, and if it does, we'll take a look at it next year and see what happens. But at this point in time, the Form 2106 is less significant. If you're doing tax preparation, you won't be seeing it often unless people, again, fall into these particular categories. So we have the Employee Business Expense Form, and then it would feed down. This is, first half of the form. This is the second half of the form. Then the $1,000 in this example would then feed over to the first line of, or to the Schedule 1 Part 2, and then to the 1040. We'll take a look at the forms in more detail in a future presentation when we just focus in on the form. Form 2106, we're going to use Form 2106 if you were an Armed Forces reservist, qualified performing artists, fee-based state or local government official, or employee with impairment-related work expenses. Due to the suspension of the miscellaneous itemized deductions subject to the 2% floor under Section 67A, employees who do not fit into one of the listed categories may not use the Form 2106. And this, again, was a change about like 2 years ago. And so people may still kind of have this Form 2106 in their mind, and you want to basically be able to state, hey, look, this has been limited in an attempt to simplify the code, and so on and so forth. So then we got to break down these categories to think about. Then if you have a taxpayer that falls into these categories, that's when this should pop into your mind and you say, Form 2106 might be applicable here. So Armed Forces reservists, who are they? Member of a reserve component. You are a member of a reserve component of the Armed Forces of the United States if you are in the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, or Coast Guard Reserve, the Army National Guard of the United States, the Air National Guard of the United States, or the Reserve Corps of the Public Health Service. Then we have the fee-based state or local government officials. So who are they? You are a qualifying fee-based official if you are employed by a state or public subdivision of a state and are compensated in whole or in part on a fee basis. And then we have the qualified performing artists. Who are they? You are a qualified performing artist if you 1. Performed services in the performing arts as an employee for at least 2 employers during the tax year. 2. Receive from at least 2 of these employers wages of $200 or more per employer. 3. Had allowed business expenses attributable to the performing arts of more than 10% of gross income from the performing artists. And 4. Had adjusted gross income of $16,000 or less before deducting expenses as a performing artist. Now, I'm not quite sure why the performing artist is like an exception here. The only thing I can think of is possibly performing artists are more likely to be hired as W-2 employees, even though they're kind of more like a contractor in essence for whatever reason within that industry. So they're trying to allow them to possibly take some of the business expenses that they would be able to take if they were a Schedule C type of business due to that circumstance. That's the only reason I can think for that, but that it is what it is. That's what it says. So in addition, if you are married, you must file a joint return unless you lived apart from your spouse for all of the tax year. If you file a joint return, you must figure requirements 1, 2, and 3 separately for both you and your spouse. However, requirement 4 applies to the combined adjusted gross income of both you and your spouse. So disabled employees with impairment-related work expenses. Impairment-related work expenses are the allowable expenses of an individual with physical or mental disabilities for attendant care at his or her place of employment. So that one would make sense. So they also include other expenses in connection with the place of employment that enable the employee to work. And you can see more on publication 463 for more details there. So there's some flow charts. These are related to the information on the forms on the IRS website that can help you to kind of walk through this questionnaire. So if you're seeing people and you're saying, hey, I think they might fall into these categories, then you can go through one of these flowchart kind of question answer formats and we'll read through them quickly. We'll provide the PDF file so you can go back to it if you want to take a look at it. So A, were you employed as an Armed Forces Reservist, a qualified performing artist, a fee-based state or local government official, or an individual with disability claiming an impairment-related work expense? See the line 10 instructions for details. If no, then you're not going to be using Form 2106. If yes, then we continue on. Did you have job-related business expenses? If you didn't have any job-related business expenses, even if you're up top and you fall into that category, then you're not going to file Form 2106. And then if yes, we go on to C and we say, were you reimbursed for any of your expenses? Count only reimbursements for employer didn't include in box 1 of your Form W-2. So in other words, and this is often the case, especially with like armed forces and whatnot, where they might have expenses, but then the expenses were reimbursed. Well, if the expenses were then reimbursed, then you don't get the deduction for the expenses. So they have to be expenses that were not reimbursed. But remember, count only reimbursements your employer didn't include in box 1 of your Form W-2. So were you reimbursed for any of your business expenses? If we say no, then the question is, what are the category of the expenses? Are you claiming job-related vehicle, travel, transportation, meals, or entertainment expenses? If yes, then you can go to the Form 2106 and go there. If no, then you're not going to be, don't file the Form 2106. And then if we go back on over to C, were your reimbursements for any of your business expenses, or were you reimbursed? If we say yes, we were reimbursed for some of them, then you would think that would limit possibly the amount that we would be able to deduct. So we're going to go to E. Did you use a vehicle in your job in 2019 that you also used for business in a prior year? If we say no, so we don't have the vehicle, then we go to F here. Are your deductible expenses more than your reimbursement? So now we got to compare the expenses we have to the reimbursement we got. Count only reimbursements your employer didn't include in box 1 of your Form W-2. For rules covering employer reporting for reimbursement expenses, see the instructions for line 7. If your expenses were greater, then you'd go to Form 2106. If not, you don't file the Form 2106. And then if we go back up to E here, did you use a vehicle in a year job in 2019? And this would be applicable. This is gotten from the 2019 instructions note, but it should be the same for 2020 for the most part here. So just the instructions aren't out yet for 2020, but you should have a similar process here. So 2019 that you also use for business in a prior year. G is either 1 or 2 true. 1, you owned this vehicle and used the actual expense method in the first year you used the vehicle for business, or 2, you used a depreciation method other than straight line for this vehicle in a prior year. If yes, then you file the Form 2106. So here's another format basically of the same flowchart, but now it's in a question and answer format. So this might be easier to read for some people. So they'll, answer question 1 and then go on to the next section that it will be asking you to go forward. It'll basically have a question and answer format, like an interview process, that will basically be doing this flowchart in a question and answer format. Remember, this is basically for 2019 instructions because the 2020 aren't out yet, but I don't believe there's a change to this one here. So I'll give you the PDF so you can walk through this, and hopefully, of course, you can go to the IRS website and look for the information when it's going to be updated and whatnot, and take a look at the updated flowchart on the IRS website at irs.gov. You're looking for the information related to Form 2106. Okay.